Good day to you, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to Getting There, a global agreement to end plastic waste. This is a Wall Street Journal custom event brought to you by our sponsor, the International Council of Chemical Associations and the World Plastics Council. I'm Philippa Layton-Jones, editor-at-large for The Trust, the custom content studio and creative consultancy at the Wall Street Journal Barron's Group. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Bob Patel, CEO of LyondellBasell and former chairman of the board for the American Chemistry Council, and also Jim Fitterling, CEO of Dow and current chairman of the board for the American Chemistry Council. Little bit of background. While chairman of the American Chemistry Council, Bob was a leading champion of the industry's responsible care program, helping it become a world-class environmental, health, safety, and security performance initiative. Following the devastation of Hurricane Harvey, Bob led ACC in convening the chemical industry along with local, state, and federal government officials to share lessons learned from the tragic aftermath of the storm, seeking to find ways to help keep communities where the industry operates safe and secure in future natural disasters. His dedication to advance the performance of the industry and its contributions to a more sustainable future became evident to all when he stepped up to help galvanize the chemical and plastics industry, together with its full value chain of consumer packaged goods companies, retailers, converters, and waste management companies, to develop a new and comprehensive strategy to help end plastic waste in the environment. And as board chair and chair of ACC's Sustainability Committee, Jim Fitterling has helped guide the industry in identifying opportunities to improve transparency and reduce the impacts of operations on air and water quality, support greater confidence in the safety of chemicals, and advance solutions that improve the health and resilience of communities. Most recently, Jim has also played a key role in supporting the industry's Future of STEM Scholars Initiative, which is the chemical industry's first collaborative equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative aimed at creating pathways for more underrepresented groups to enter and succeed the chemical industry through scholarships, internships, mentoring, and leadership training for students majoring in science, technology, engineering, and math at historically Black colleges and universities. So welcome to you both, Jim and Bob. It's great to have you here, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Jim. So a few housekeeping notes before we begin. To the audience, please submit any questions you might have for the panelists at the bottom right box below the video screen. If you encounter any difficulties, please take a look at our tech tips by clicking the small question mark on the top right of the site. And to set the stage for our first conversation, I'd like to take a moment to ask for some audience opinion on the issue of advanced recycling. So please take a moment to answer the poll to the right of your screen. The question is, today, demand for recycled plastic far exceeds supply. Current supply meets only 6% of demand, according to closed loop partners. So, how critical is advanced recycling to solving the plastic supply problem and helping to eliminate plastic waste? I'm going to come back to the answers to that in a second when we've had a chance to answer, but I'm going to get started with questions in the meantime. So today, Bob and Jim, we're talking about plastic waste, plastic produced and discarded in ways that we know are damaging to people and planet. So it's clearly helpful to put some data on this. And I'd love for you to give us some sense of the scale of this problem. Perhaps, Bob, we can start with you and then come to Jim.
Great, thank you, Philippa. It's good to be with you, and it's good to be with Jim, whom I've worked alongside in the American Chemistry Council for many years now. First of all, the discussion around plastic waste, it's in our everyday lives, whether it's in our business environment or in our personal lives. And the question that I get often is, can we enjoy the benefits of plastics and deal with the issue of plastic waste? And I would say to you emphatically, yes, we can solve the issue of plastic waste. The challenge is we're not going to be able to do it as an industry by ourselves. We will need governments, NGOs, and the value chain, as you mentioned, to come together to solve this problem. We know that we don't want we don't want plastic waste in the environment. Back in 2018, when I was the chairman of the American Chemistry Council, Jim, myself, and a few other CEOs, we got together and we said, we need to engage the entire value chain. So chemical companies, plastics producers, converters, consumer brands, retailers, and waste handlers. And I would actually add to that consumers themselves. If we all come together and try to solve this problem, I have no doubt we can solve it. Now, let me dimensionalize this for you. About 400 million tons of plastics are produced every year. Only about 70% of the waste is recovered. That means 30% is ending up in the environment uncontrolled. Of the 70% that's recovered, only 15% is recycled. We have to ask ourselves, why can't that number be 2-3 times larger in terms of recycling? We know we can do that.
Understood. And Jim, same question to you.
Yeah, just to follow on Bob's comments, what we're in is a world that is looking at natural resources and the depletion of those, and also looking at what has evolved over time into a very linear economy where things are used once, thrown away, or landfilled, or if they're not controlled in a good waste management environment, they get into the environment and they create other problems. And we're talking about moving to a circular economy. One of the other dimensions of this is the ability for people to actually recycle the materials. Many places don't have existing waste management infrastructure. When Bob and I worked to create the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, our initial focus was on Southeast Asia, because 10 rivers in Asia really represented the bulk of the waste that was getting into the ocean. Many of those countries don't have enough infrastructure to keep up with waste management of all kinds of waste, including plastics. And so in that part of the world, it's an infrastructure issue. In developed parts of the world, it's more a recycling issue and a collection issue. And in Europe, we've seen, above 30% recycle rates for quite some time. In the United States, we're below 10%. Availability of curbside recycling may be there in many cities, but availability for all forms of plastics to be recycled usually isn't there. And so we need to improve collections, do education to get communities involved in recycling, because as we mentioned, the supply is starting to exceed the demand. And so there's definite pull from the consumer and all of our stakeholders to bring more post-consumer recycled material to the market.
Excellent. Thank you for those. Those are excellent data points. Thank you so much for that. I'm seeing the results of our poll, which looks pretty emphatic. How critical is advanced recycling to solving the plastic supply problem, helping to eliminate plastic waste? 80% of our audience says very. So that's an audience that seems very well versed, I'm sure, in the issue of advanced recycling. But let me ask you both, how well understood is advanced recycling by the general public? Is there a sort of a nuance there? Is there an understanding of what the sort of full gamut of recycling means when we're talking about it in these terms? Jim, let me start with you.
Yeah, so let's just maybe a little bit of comparison between mechanical recycling and advanced recycling. The easiest form of recycling is mechanical recycling. It takes the least amount of energy, and you take a plastic at the end of its life. If it's clean, you chop it up, you melt it, and you make another plastic material out of it. Clean is the important characteristic there. And as you know, a lot of plastics come into food contact and liquid contact and need to be cleaned before they can be recycled. That's where advanced recycling comes in. In advanced recycling, we break that plastic back down to a molecular component, and then we make plastics out of it again. It's a little more energy intensive, but on a life cycle analysis compared to starting from a natural gas or an oil well and going all the way to plastics, it's much, much less intensive. And so advanced recycling helps us to take streams that might not be able to be mechanically recycled and bring them back into a high quality fashion plastic, which could be used again in a food application, maybe in a pharmaceutical application, where a mechanical recycled product probably couldn't.
Excellent. And Bob, and we'll come into this in more depth later on, but just on that question of how well understood is advanced recycling by the general public, what's your sense on that?
I don't think it's as well understood. I think generally the public sees that as pyrolysis or kind of a burning process. However, some of the benefits beyond what Jim mentioned about related to advanced recycling are that you can actually put in mixed plastic waste that comes from similar chemistry and recycle it. And as Jim mentioned, we produce new feedstock, which produces new polymers, which are FDA approved and can be used in food applications, medical applications, and so on. One other point about advanced recycling that I think will enhance its attractiveness is that if we can use renewable based energy to power these recycling plants, then theoretically you're not adding any more carbon content to create feedstock. I think that could be very compelling.
Excellent. Now, let's move on. And we heard your credentials there earlier on. So this issue is obviously extremely important to both of you and both of your companies. So let's go into a little more detail on why is this issue of plastic waste and recycling important to Dow and LyondellBasell? So Jim, let's start with you.
Well, I think in the first case, plastics are an important product for the world's consumers. And as we think about a future, we're trying to address not only the waste and the circularity issues, we're trying to address a world that needs lower carbon emissions. Plastics of their nature have helped us to do things like lightweight automobiles, make wind blades, make solar assemblies for electric power, make EVs, which have much more content of plastics in them. And all these things help to make things lighter weight, which reduces the overall CO2 emissions. Plastics themselves have CO2 footprints that are 4 to 5 times lower than their alternatives like glass and aluminum, steel, and paper. And so I think as we've seen the history of plastics evolve, every time we're trying to make something lighter, cleaner, faster, or stronger for our customers, we end up moving towards a polymer technology. And I think that's going to continue for the future. It'll be hard for us to get to a low carbon future without plastics because of the inherent properties and the way that we can design those properties. The other thing they do is protect our food and our medical products in the supply chain. And many times the contents of those products have a CO2 impact as well. So food waste on its own is a very high CO2 emission source. So protecting food and shelf life of food in the grocery store, we can take shelf life of meats, cheeses, other products, and extend them from a few days to several weeks, which is a tremendous savings and a tremendous reduction in waste. So solving world hunger and the UN Sustainable Development Goals around world hunger isn't going to be possible without plastic. So we see it as a tool for a sustainable future and a product that's very sustainable today, but is under attack and is misunderstood, I think, in some circles.
Bob, is that the same for you?
Indeed, and I would summarize by saying that plastics are a very sustainable material. They contribute to sustainability, as Jim mentioned, keeping food fresh or lightweighting of vehicles to enable EVs to go further on a single charge. I think what we have to do is separate the issue of plastic waste from the benefits of plastics. And that's where our company, Jim's company, others in the industry and across the value chain are focused on addressing the issue of plastic waste so that we can continue to enjoy the benefits of plastics. Without plastics, I don't see how we can have the kind of CO2 reduction we need across multiple value chains. Let me give you a couple of stats. So there's this debate about paper bag versus plastic. You have to use a paper bag 3 times to have the same footprint as an environmental footprint as a single-use plastic bag. Cotton bags have to be used more than 130 times to have the same environmental footprint as a single-use plastic bag. I mean, think about that. If we can recover the waste, then clearly the plastic bag is the best choice.
And we've seen that in quite high profile in the media when we're talking about canvas bags and you know how you produce even as a sort of a sustainable tote bag. So this is clearly, you know, awareness is growing, and this is clearly a critical time for plastics. But let me ask you, how much time do you spend on these issues as CEOs? Jim, let me ask you first.
Well, I used to say it was a quarter of the time, but I would say today it's in every investor call that I participate in. It's with every customer. There's not a research innovation project that we've got in the company that doesn't involve sustainability or circularity. And so I would say it's just front and center. It's a critical part of the strategy of the company. It's important not only from the internal side in terms of how we make the plastics, but all the products that we make for the consumer. So it is something that's time consuming, but it's something that's important to all of our stakeholders. It doesn't matter if we're hiring new employees, they all want to tackle the challenge. It doesn't matter if we're trying to attract new investors. More and more, the money is moving into ESG investing, and they want to understand what our solutions are for the problem.
Mm-hmm. So it's a multi-stakeholder thing. Bob, same question to you.
Indeed, circularity is at the center of our strategy. In fact, we recently issued our latest sustainability report in which we've committed to 2 million tons of recycled plastics sold by the end of the decade, by 2030. We recently also launched our Circulen brand, which has 3 sort of platforms, Circulen Renew, Circulen Recover, and Circulen Revive. And essentially, it's mechanical recycling, molecular recycling, and renewable-based feedstocks. And I think we're going to have to do all of that. Circularity means not just mechanical recycling or not just advanced recycling. And as Jim said, it's going to take collaboration across the value chain to really make a difference. And frankly, for me, the plastic waste issue is personal. I know it can be solved, and we just have to focus on it and collaborate with governments and NGOs so that we don't lose the benefits of plastics.
Let me address an elephant in the room, because there will be a school of opinion that says, well, why don't we just ban plastic? Now, a lot of what you've just said is, you know, that makes no sense because we can only achieve many of the things that we're trying to do by keeping polymers in the system, by keeping plastics in the system. How would you answer the notion of banning plastic is the way to reduce plastic and end plastic waste? Jim, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, it isn't a linear problem. It's a complex problem. And so if you ban plastics, many times you drive people to use alternative materials that have a much higher carbon footprint and a much higher waste footprint. We would see, for example, solid waste that goes to landfills or is burned or goes to other outlets increase by 25 to 50% by going to other materials. And we would see the CO2 footprint go up by 4 to 5 times, all at a time where we're trying to tackle climate change, and it isn't going to move us in the right direction. That probably is not well understood by people, which is one of the reasons we always talk about life cycle assessment. A good life cycle assessment from cradle to grave on different materials will tell you which ones are the most sustainable. And some of the studies that have recently been done would show that, you know, the product that's inside a package right now usually has much greater environmental impact than the package itself. packaging lowers that impact. It also lowers the shipping cost of different materials, and the shipping cost oftentimes is the highest CO2 footprint. So Bob gave the example of a paper bag. If you have a truckload of plastic bags, plastic grocery shopping bags, and you want to replace that with paper bags, you need 4 truckloads of paper bags to replace 1 truckload of plastic bags. And you've got to ship all that material. That's a pretty significant CO2 impact. So looking at life cycle assessment holistically, I think will drive you toward the right solution. And banning things doesn't really help. But when you're trying to solve both CO2 and circularity, you need all the solutions on the table, and then you need policies that help drive people there, and also policies that help the capital markets move in with their tremendous liquidity, looking for good investments in this space.
Bob, same question.
Indeed, I think more awareness of the alternatives and the footprint of the alternatives will be very important. And I think, again, here we have to separate the benefits from the challenge. And I think many consumers don't realize, as Jim said, like, for example, glass bottles for water compared to plastic water bottles, how much heavier that truck is, and the recyclability of glass, the collection of the glass, that's also not easy. So I think life cycle analysis is important. And frankly, ultimately, instead of cradle to grave, can we actually create circular models? So there is no grave. We have recover, we reuse, we recycle, and then reuse. I think that's the answer. Close the loop, create circular models.
Excellent. And just staying on this theme, and I know you've told us a lot about the alternatives to plastic right now, but tell us a little bit more, if you can, about the shortcomings of other materials that might be seen as alternatives to plastics, because I think that's such an important point. And especially, if you will, from a sustainability point of view. Bob, I'm going to stay with you on this one.
Indeed. So if you think about glass manufacturing, just the manufacturing itself has its own environmental footprint. Adding to that, the weight of the glass when it's shipped. Steel. I've seen recently water in steel cans. Imagine the footprint of that. Even if the can is recyclable afterwards, the life cycle analysis of that would fall far short of the benefits of plastics. And paper, Jim mentioned, and I mentioned some statistics earlier. I just think we need to bring more of this to light to consumers so they can make smart choices about how to best protect the environment that we all live in.
Thank you. And now I want to turn to some of the solutions, because you've talked about some of the solutions. We talked earlier a little bit about the particulars of advanced recycling. Your efforts really are focused on keeping plastics in the chain, reused and recycled. I'd love for you to tell us here about the broad mission around that. But then if we could also dive in a little bit more into advanced recycling and look at where is it being done and who is leading the field here. Bob, let's stay with you on this.
Sure. So maybe I could start more broadly and talk about what it's going to take to get to a higher level of recycling. I think ultimately the consumer will pull the value chain. The consumer is already demanding more recycled content, and they're willing to pay a bit more for it. And frankly, if we pay 2-3 cents more for a shampoo bottle that has recycled content, we're likely not going to notice that. But it could go a long way in incenting infrastructure to collect waste, to build these recycling plants, and to close the loop. Working backwards, as we talk with brand owners are demanding more recycled content, more recycled products. Mechanical recycling is already underway, it's happening. Advanced recycling, there are several different technologies out there. Most are pyrolysis sort of technologies. Our company is developing one. I know many other of our peers in the industry are developing technologies. I think on advanced recycling at scale, we're 2 to 4 years away from this being very prevalent globally. And I think this could really be a game changer. And when you think about advanced recycling and it's powered or fueled with renewable energy, we have the potential of not adding any more carbon content to do recycling. Let's continue to work backwards. In order for these recycling plants to operate at scale, we need more waste to be taken out of the landfills, to be collected and brought to these recycling centers. And that's where a lot more infrastructure is needed. Trillions of dollars of infrastructure is needed globally. This will require some global coordination, and then depending on the maturity of different regions, the infrastructure investment will differ. But I think getting the waste out of the landfills and into the recycling plants will become a very, very critical factor on how much recycling scales.
Bob, is that achievable?
I think it can be done, absolutely. But we'll have to show the value of recycling and along the entire value chain, there has to be some incentive. And I think the consumer has to pull all of this. And at the end, the consumer also plays a role in disposing of the waste properly. So when we talk about value chains, lately I've been more and more thinking that the consumer plays a very important role in preventing the waste from getting in the environment and separating more at the source so that the waste handlers don't have to put a lot more money into sorting technology and the collection becomes easier. So look, we all have a stake in this, whether we're consumers or we're industrial companies or we're a brand. I think coming together, collaborating, innovating, that's the answer.
Thank you, Bob. Jim, same question to you. So let's talk about the broad mission to keep plastics in the chain. And then on that notion of advanced recycling, where do you see the most progress being made? And what's your view on how achievable it is and in what time frame?
Well, we're seeing a lot of good work for a number of years on design for circularity. And so you can see right now that, even in the United States, we're pushing for a national strategy that would require all plastic packaging to have 30% recycled content by 2030. I would call that design for circularity. That means the plastics producers and also the recyclers and the converters are going to have to work to design packages for the brand owners that have that kind of content and also meet their standards. And we're starting to see that demand pull is there from the brand owners and from the retailers, and it is pulling the supply with it. We're a bit behind on supply. As Bob mentioned, collections is a bit of an issue in the States. Our recycle rate is not very high. We worked with the EPA in the previous administration to set a target for 50% recycling in the United States from single digits where we are today. That's going to mean we have to make it more available and easier for the consumers to access it. Today, in many cases, you can put a lot of materials into your curbside bin, but certain plastics, you might have to bundle up and take them to the grocery store to be recycled. As Bob mentioned, we just have to make that easier. There's no reason that should have to be hand carried by the consumer back to a grocery store to be collected. We should be able to do that through curbside recycling and also through our recycling facilities. And then we've got to scale the new technologies to get enough good quality material into that supply chain to meet that demand. The other thing we need to look at is responsibility. Both on, it is a little more expensive to recycle the plastics than it is to make virgin plastics. And so in Europe, there's been good success with an enhanced producer responsibility scheme. And that money in that scheme goes to really drive the conversion of plastics back into raw materials that can be used again. I think we need to look at that and design that for an American type system to be put in place here. There are a lot of money that is being invested right now. There's over $5 billion right now that's being invested in recycling facilities, and there are quite a few entrepreneurs and circular capital models in place that are taking that ESG investment dollar and putting it to work. So let me give you a couple of examples. We worked with Mura Technologies in the UK to do a partnership to support a hydrothermal plastic recycling solution. And that's advanced recycling that looks at preventing carbon from entering the environment while creating that feedstock that Bob talked about for circular sustainable plastics. We think that we can save about 1.5 tons of CO2 per ton of plastic recycled compared to incinerating unrecycled plastics. And we're also looking at other partnerships to make new feedstocks from recycled plastic waste back into polymers. Right now, we've got a certain cry from the consumers and a demand pull through the value chain. And this is the time for US Congress to act on policies that increase recycling and that attract that capital money into the market to drive these solutions. And I think we've got a real opportunity, as Bob said. This is very solvable. It's much easier to solve than some of the other big challenges we have.
So let me ask you about the role of chemical companies in leading science and R&D here. Clearly, this is central to all of your businesses, as you've outlined, but how do you think about this role as we enter an even more technologically advanced and climate-focused landscape? What does the chemicals industry know that can be applied elsewhere? Jim, I'm going to start with you.
How to scale up processes. I think the biggest thing that we can do is how to take good ideas that can be done at a small scale and take them to world scale. And so if you think about what we do today in order to make a product, we make plastics today at a scale of a world scale asset might be 500,000-600,000 tons per year production. We'll do our research at a 15 mil scale in the lab, and then we can scale up from there. So I think as you look at alternative materials like renewable feedstocks, if you look at advanced recycling, where industry plays a role is to take good solutions and scale them up. And this is where partners like the Recycling Partnership, Circulate Capital, Closed Loop are really important partners. They're going to work with a lot of startups to find very interesting new technologies, and they're going to reach a point where those startups need help to make that scale jump to 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 tons. And at that point, we really start to have a dramatic impact on the amount of waste that we're diverting from the environment.
Bob, same question.
Yeah. And adding to that, designing in circularity, as Jim mentioned earlier, that requires a knowledge of the chemistry. So, for example, if there's a food package that Procter & Gamble is developing, and they want to make it more recyclable, well, we, with our knowledge of the chemistry of the polymers, can help think through that. We can work with the converter, with the brand, together across the value chain. And I think that's the opportunity for our industry, is to bring to bear our knowledge of the chemistry and what's possible, along with what the consumer demands. And putting all that together, I think we can solve this waste issue.
Thank you. Let's talk about, for a second, job creation. What data can you share with us about jobs created as the chemicals industry evolves and how those roles changing? Can you tell us about how this effort impacts the informal sector too? Bob, I'm going to come to you first.
Sure. So first of all, we're a significant employer in the U.S. and in Europe and around the world as an industry. But what we're finding in terms of employment, as new employees come in, they're very focused on environment and circularity. The next generation are extremely focused on protecting our environment. And as we work through our sustainability strategy, we find that the engagement level is very high. And in fact, they become ambassadors for us. I think employment can continue to increase in our industry. Recycling will be the next wave of sort of new employment that will come. And as plastics continue to enable a better climate because of lightweighting of vehicles and keeping food fresh and solving for food security, we're going to need more plastics production over time, even with recycling rates rising. So I think there's a real economic benefit globally here, and recycling will play a really central role in enabling the next phase of our industry and the employment that goes with that.
Jim.
Yeah, the recycling partnership that I mentioned recently released a report outlining that with just a $17 billion investment over 5 years to really transform the U.S. residential recycling system, we could improve the U.S. curbside recycling rate to nearly 70% and deliver more than $30 billion in economic benefits. That alone would create about 200,000 new jobs within 10 years. In that same time period, that same amount of investment would also save 710 million tons of CO2 equivalent, reduce the average water use of 30 million people. It would save the equivalent of 129 million car emissions and avoid about 9.4 billion in landfill costs and create about $8.8 billion in new high quality recyclable commodities. So there is an economic case and there is a market case to be made for creating this circular economy and really spinning up the new companies that are in the value chain that are going to create that raw material and close that loop.
Excellent, thank you. We're going to come to another poll in just a second, but let me ask you first a short but very big question. What happens if we don't get circularity right? Jim?
We continue to drive more waste through a linear economy and have more issues that we have to tackle. I also think we will have issues like plastic leakage. The more waste that gets generated, where there is no recycling capability, people will be tempted to ship that waste offshore, and things will happen like we saw in Asia, where developed countries were shipping waste to Asia, to countries that had no waste management infrastructures, and it was going into open dumps on beaches, sometimes within 100 yards of the shoreline. And of course, then when any kind of a weather event happens, it washes out to the ocean. We can't have that. And that requires not just companies like Bob's and mine, that requires governments, that require local municipalities. Everybody's got to keep a focus on keeping a clean environment, having the infrastructure in place that we need to stop that waste from going to the environment, and then finding a way to turn it back into a useful product. It's a rethink of the way that we've been doing things for more than the last 60 years, maybe the last 100 years.
Bob?
I mean, I think the other risk here is that there's substitution with less sustainable materials than plastics. So when you think about the life cycle analysis, and I think that would be a pity if that were to happen. And as Jim mentioned, really the focus needs to be on reducing and ultimately eliminating the leakage of waste into the environment. And when I think about that, I think each part of the world has different challenges. In the US, we have less leakage, but low recycling rates. In Europe, there's very little leakage, better recycling rates, but they could even be higher in Europe. In many parts of Asia and the developing world, they don't have the simple infrastructure to even collect the waste. That has to be addressed. So it's not a one size fits all. I think there are different regions in the world are at different phases in terms of development. And the very basic prevention of leakage is a very serious problem, must be addressed.
Thank you. Now, to the audience, we have another poll for you all. So please answer to the right hand of your side of your screen again. And the question here is, what is the most important action an international agreement can take to accelerate a global transition to a circular economy, which, as Bob and Jim described there, is so important? And while we wait for the results of that, Bob and Jim, tell me, what's the role of governments in expanding these efforts? What's holding advanced recycling back in Asia or in Africa, for example? And tell us what your companies are doing to scale up these operations and what you've learned that we can apply elsewhere. Jim, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I believe that one of the first things is national targets. And so when you look at national plans, we need national targets from the governments, commitments from governments to eliminate plastic leakage and keep the waste materials here and solve the waste problems and circular problems here, rather than adding to them by shipping them and creating an even bigger CO2 footprint. And then national action plans to get the curbside recycling rate up, to get the recycling facilities built, understanding that it is more expensive than what we do today making virgin products, but simple policies that are in place can help offset that CapEx and operating expense. And then obviously there are a lot of experts on design. So requiring design of post-consumer recycled material into the finished product, like we talked about, the ACC targets were to have 30% post-consumer recycled material in the packaging material by the 2030s. I think that's an effective target. That target drives a lot of innovation, a lot of change. Incentivizing investments in the advanced recycling technologies and facilities obviously has to be done on a local level. And then having kind of an all of the above policy, as Bob mentioned, renewable feedstocks, advanced recycled feedstocks, and additional mechanical recycling, supporting investments of all of those will help create the demand pull on top of the work that the brand owners are doing today, which is committing more money and requiring more recycle in their products.
Bob, same question.
Yes, so just maybe highlighting a couple of the points and adding to what Jim said, having more waste management infrastructure is super important. And we see that on the poll here. It's right at the top of the list. And as you go around the world, it's less sophisticated in the areas where the leakage rates are the highest. And I think that has to be a priority globally to get the waste management infrastructure up to a certain minimum standard. Then encouraging recycling rates, mandating recycling rates even, but have a path to understanding how then those mandates can be met. And I think that's where governments can play a role. And if there is this EPR sort of scheme in the US or in other parts of the world, I think that works quite well, because whatever is collected through that scheme in terms of dollars or euros, it's put right back into promoting circularity. So it doesn't get misallocated to another problem, if you will. It comes right back into incenting recycling infrastructure. And so I think this collection challenge is far greater than we know in many parts of the world, and getting everybody to the same level globally on stopping the leakage is the first step, and then incenting the recycling to occur.
Thank you for that. So let's look at the results of this poll just in. So what's the most important action an international agreement can take? So far and away, that there's a sort of most popular answer: assist with waste management infrastructure and capacity building. As you've been saying, it's about that curbside collection. It's about building that infrastructure that helps get the plastic in the right place in the first place. But then encouraging governments to commit to eliminate plastic leakage into the environment. So that governmental action, as you've been describing there as well, is obviously is clearly important. I'm going to come to audience questions in just a second, but my final question really, do we need a Paris Agreement to deal with this issue of plastic recycling? And if so, how do we make that happen? Bob, I'll come to you first.
Well, I think the United Nations could be a part of that. They could be the convening body to set global standards. And I think a lot of this is also sharing best practices. So if a region like Europe, for example, is very advanced in how they're doing recycling, why can't that be shared with the governments in Indonesia and the Philippines, in many parts of Asia, or in Latin America? I think the UN could be a convening body for that, and we're certainly ready to engage in helping develop that.
Jim, to you.
I think I think a global agreement would elevate the issue, much like we're talking about with CO2 emissions. It not only elevates the issue, but it creates dialogue around the solutions. And then you obviously, it's hard to do a global mandate on what every country needs to do specifically, but it gives countries the ability then to take global solutions down to a local level and look at what works best for them. And I think you don't want to take the levers out of the local government, the state governments, the federal government's hands to drive that policy. Waste recycling is a very discrete issue. I mean, we talk about it back to the curbside, but where I live, our recycle gets collected once a month, and our waste gets collected every week. If you would imagine a scenario where that was inverted, it would start to drive, I think, a change of behavior of people recycling more, or at least on an equal basis. You get your recycling picked up as often as you do your waste. And I know here, we have much more recycle than we do waste out of the house. And so it would, I think, do a lot. It's a simple move, but it would do a lot to accelerate that transition.
Excellent. We are going to come to audience Q&A in just a second, but before that, we have a quick video that helps us understand the circular economy for plastic. So we'll roll that and then we'll come to audience Q&A. Please, if you still have questions, do submit them, though I see we have quite a few in for the rest of our session. So please roll the video. Thank you.
We all can agree that plastics are practically limitless in their capabilities to move society forward. We can also agree that plastic waste is a worldwide problem that requires action from all of us.
That's why the world's plastic makers have united to support 5 principles to end plastic waste globally.
Our goal is to create a circular economy where plastics are reused, recovered, and remade.
First, we need a global agreement among nations to eliminate plastic waste.
Second, achieve widespread access to waste collection.
Third, recognize the role plastics play in a lower carbon future.
Fourth, support innovation in product design and recycling technology to create products that do more with less and are easier to recycle.
And finally, we must measure progress.
There's widespread agreement that plastics play a critical role in making our lives better.
That's why we need a global agreement among nations to end plastic waste.
For today,
and especially tomorrow.
Join us.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to get started with questions. I'm going to start at the top. This is from Thomas Sorensen. What are your thoughts on more defined value chains, such as end-of-life tires for chemical recycling of valuable resources? There are some industrial collaborations. Thoughts on defined value chains? Who wants to take that?
Well, we see, I think some people would talk about upcycling of the waste materials. When we see many end uses that are coming into play right now, we're working in certain areas right now to take hard to recycle plastic waste and put it in as part of the aggregate binder for roads, for infrastructure projects. It can also go into building materials like cement blocks that are with aggregates that have plastics inside them that make them much stronger. It can go into things like tires. It can go into things like architectural decking. So you see the replacement for wood with architectural decking that has strength. all these compounds allow you to take what might have been a very, very inexpensive, lower quality product and then upcycle it into something that has a much longer and more useful life. So I think it's a key area. We're looking at a lot of those partnerships today with different members of the value chain. And a lot of our converters that make packaging are also working with recycling companies to try to devise, when we recycle these materials, what are the products on the back end of that facility that they are going to sell? And many times they won't just sell the resins itself, but they will actually make products at those facilities and sell the end products. And I think that's a creative way to think about it.
Bob, do you have thoughts on that?
I think creating solutions that include recycled content, as Jim is mentioning, and the roads and the infrastructure, I think those are great examples of not all the recycling means that it has to go back into food packaging. There's so many applications, and I think we're at the early stages in terms of understanding the applicability of plastics in these composites. For example, the roads that Jim described that have some plastic waste in them, they're actually more durable, more pliable in climates where you have cold temperatures in the winter and hot temperatures in the summer. So I think we're on the front end of really understanding all the applications and solutions that can be enabled by recycled plastic.
Thank you. Couple of questions on the same theme here. One is from Annie Brown, one is from Sandra Bear. Is all plastic recyclable or just some plastics? And there is too much plastic that's not recyclable and doesn't degenerate over time. What changes do you recommend to change this paradigm?
We set a target to have all of the materials that we make be 100% recyclable by 2035. Over 80% of the materials we make today are. There are some complex structures today that are designed to carry some difficult liquids and other things that will need some work, some polymer redesign to get there. And then there are some rigid materials that are compounds that are much harder to recycle. But I would say everybody is working along the lines of trying to make everything that we make recyclable. An awful lot of plastics today are recyclable. It's just that they don't get collected and there's not an economic incentive to make that happen. So we need to try to create that and create that demand pull.
Indeed, I think until we get to a point where we've recovered all the plastic that we can recover for recycling, this kind of issue of the remainder that can't be recycled, that may end up only being 5 or 10%. The opportunity is in the 80% that can be recycled. How do we get all of that in a circular economy?
Okay, here's one from Suresh Ramanathan. Is it really realistic to recycle plastic? Number 5 plastics and higher are not recycled in a lot of communities in the US. His community and the recycler they work with do not accept number 5 and higher. So is there an issue there? As you did allude to this earlier, that look, you can't, with some plastics, you have to take them elsewhere. They don't naturally go into the recycling system. So does that put the onus too heavily on the consumer? Is there more that needs to be done there?
Well, I think advanced recycling will be an answer to this. The 5 through 7s could be really good feedstock for advanced recycling. And that's why, as both Jim and I have said throughout the conversation today, we need mechanical recycling and we need advanced recycling. And then we can work with the brand owners to design in circularity. In other words, if there are some 5 through 7s that simply can't be recycled, maybe there's a different way to design the package. So it can be. But I think advanced recycling will be an important part of the answer here.
Thank you. Jim, you had thoughts too.
And in a developed economy where you have a very robust chemical industry, recycling industry, much easier to see how that happens. In a developing economy where you don't have that infrastructure, it may be much more challenging. And so I think you have to look at, locally, what do you allow to happen? It may need, in a developing economy, you would have to move some of those 5 through 7 materials to some place that had the capability to recycle them. But as we've talked about before, most of the 2s, 3s, 4s materials are readily recyclable today.
Thank you. This one is from Valerie Perrick. Is there a way to ensure a circular economy is maintained with a high degree of transparency? Is it possible for major players to pursue their interests while staying open? She thinks that would be a game changer for policymakers. What are your thoughts? Bob, let's come to you first on that.
Well, I think reporting on recycling rates will become more and more prevalent. And we as a company are very open to that. And we think by highlighting the potential that recycling holds, I think that will help incent the investments required across the value chain to have a bigger circular economy. So I think visibility and transparency with metrics is always positive, and it shines a light on what's possible.
Jim.
Strong parallels to what we see happening in carbon emissions today, where industry is working very hard to understand its scope 1 and 2 emissions and really get that traceable and auditable, and then build on the scope 3 emissions and getting the data from their suppliers so that we can ultimately have a product carbon footprint on products and make that visible both to the converters, the brand owners, and ultimately to the consumer. And I think the same thing can be done in plastics. We talk about on mechanical recycling, it's relatively straightforward to do because the mass balance is just the volumes. On advanced recycling, because you're converting it back into a feedstock, I think you have to have traceability and an audit trail. And digital tools are helping us not only in recycling facilities and sorting and all the other things that we need to do to enable recycling, but those digital tools will help us on the mass balancing and the ability to give the consumer, the brand owner, the data that they need to support their claims in the marketplace. None of us wants greenwashing. We all want to make sure that we're doing it right and doing it by the books. And we're going to have to stand up to government scrutiny and regulatory scrutiny, because as ESG investing moves money into this space, it's going to require some governance and some rules that we need to play by.
Excellent. Thank you. One from Stephen Schuller. Is it possible to make containers or bottles that do not use fossil fuels as inputs?
How much do you want to pay? I mean, this is the hard thing. I think sometimes people believe that we're not interested because we have a business that today makes plastics out of fossil fuels, but we all look at alternative materials all the time, and there are many trade-offs that go into it. We, a few years back, looked at making ethanol from sugarcane, taking that to ethylene, making that to polyethylene, so we could say that was a renewable source. But just for one world-scale plastics plant, it was 120,000 hectares of sugarcane. Very, very quickly on renewables, you get into a space, you're competing with food crops and many other sustainable issues. So we have to look at those trade-offs as well and try to understand what they are. Certain things can be done on a small scale in a niche environment, but when you get to the scale of 400 million tons per year of production, and you try to convert that all to renewables, and you want to take that all back to, say, something that's plant-based, now we start to have a very different impact on the environment.
And I would add to that the trade-offs on performance of the end products would probably not be suitable. In many cases, if it was a renewable-based source in terms of the feedstock, perhaps the performance of that product wouldn't match the performance of a carbon-based. And as Jim mentioned, some of this can be done, but likely on the periphery. The core likely still requires carbon input. I think our challenge as an industry is when we convert the feedstock into plastics, how do we continually reduce the amount of energy we need to convert from feedstock to plastics, and how do we reduce the emissions over time? I think that, combined with the circularity topic that we've been talking about today, I think can have a tremendous impact in the core of the plastics business and still allow consumers to enjoy all the benefits of how plastics enable everyday life.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question before we must wrap. So this is from David Milner. How would you answer the following proposition? Until plastic degrades back to the fundamental, naturally present elements, then manufacturing plastic is not appropriate except for unique use cases. We did touch on this a little bit earlier, but I want to give you the final word on this, Jim.
When you design plastics for packaging or any other application, you're designing it not to degrade. You're designing it to protect something. You're designing it to have a life. So I think to hang degradability out there and say that is the ultimate is working against the whole proposition of why we're making these products in the first place. If I design a plastic film for a solar PV cell that sits out in the desert, I don't want that to degrade. I want it to protect that solar cell. If I design it for a food product, I don't want it to start to degrade as soon as I ship it. And I certainly don't want that in a medical application. And I think that's the challenge. So I wouldn't agree to that. In our lifetime, and I think I will see this while I'm still working, you will have plastics that are made from fossil fuels that have a zero carbon footprint. I think we have the capability to take the carbon footprint of those plastics to zero. And if we can increase recycling, I think you'll take the most sustainable product in the world and make it 2 or 3 times more sustainable.
Thank you. And final word to you, Bob.
Thank you. And I agree on the degradability. I think it would defeat the purpose of the plastics and would not be, they wouldn't serve their purpose in almost all applications. I think our focus needs to continue to be on eliminating waste from entering the environment, closing the loop so that we can recover the waste and reuse it over and over again. And as I mentioned earlier, whether it's in advanced recycling or the initial production of the plastics, we have to continue to work the emissions and the carbon input down, and we can get to zero over time. This will require innovation, small scale innovation, which will get scaled up over time. But our industry and the value chain have shown time and time again, when we come together and we put our collective experience together, we can solve these sorts of challenging problems. And I'm convinced, as Jim said, during my lifetime, I think circularity will become the norm. I think recycling will become the norm. And I do think that plastics will prove that they're a very sustainable material.
Bob, but Jim, these have been incredibly useful insights. Thank you so much for these insights into what's happening with plastic wastes. And there's so much to take away from this that advances our understanding of this issue of, as you said, a time of incredible focus and awareness about the impact of our behaviors on our world. So thank you to the American Chemistry Council for sponsoring this event, and thanks to our audience for such active participation today and for joining us. Thanks to Bob and Jim for telling us about these solutions to plastic waste, and thanks all for your time today.
Thank you.